Chosen one, welcome, extraordinary souls. Yes, you. Don't look around like I'm talking to someone else. I mean you. The one who's been underestimated, misjudged, written off. And yet somehow you keep showing up. You know why they watch you so closely? Because deep down, even they can feel it. There's something about you they can't quite name, can't control, and certainly can't extinguish. And that's why they gather. That's why they whisper. That's why they need each other, just to come against one of you. Let me tell you something no one else has dared to say. The fact that it takes a whole crowd to try and take you down. That's proof you're not ordinary. Ordinary doesn't scare people. Ordinary doesn't disrupt their illusions. But you shine without permission. You move without needing validation. You carry something in you that even the darkest room can't ignore. So today, let this sink in. You are not here to blend in. You are here to shake the very ground they thought was solid. You are here to remind them what truth looks like. They thought you'd fold. You didn't. They thought you'd shrink. You grew. And now, they're confused. Good. Stay confusing to them. Stay undeniable. Because you were never the problem. You've always been the proof. Proof that light doesn't ask for permission to exist. Proof that one aligned soul is more powerful than 1,000 lost ones. So hold your head up. You are not here by accident. You are not ordinary. And if they need an army to face you, that's because heaven already decided you don't lose. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. It took a swarm of hands to try dismantling what was planted by an invisible force. That truth they will never say aloud. This was never about a single critic, a lone whisperer, or an isolated saboteur. What rose against you was an alliance of contradictions, people who could barely stand each other suddenly marching in step, just to corner you. And yet, it was never about you failing at anything. It was about your quiet presence, casting light into corners they hoped would remain unlit. You didn't demand eyes on you. You didn't posture. Yet something about your calm deflated the illusions they spent their lives weaving. Instead of turning inward, they built walls together. They passed messages like contraband, flung sharp glances in daylight, and engineered traps just to watch you stumble. Their hope was simple, that pressure would collapse you, that isolation would break your resolve, that your silence would give them material to feel superior. But you didn't. That's when fear gripped them, because everyone watching saw you walk through the maze they constructed, and you emerged untouched. You didn't retaliate. You didn't plead. You simply moved forward, and that quiet defiance rattled them more than anything else, confirming their worst suspicion, that your foundation came from a place they could never touch. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. They overlooked what solitude had already carved into you. While they spent nights assembling schemes, you were being sharpened where no one could see. You learned how to read intentions behind smiles, how to detect quiet venom, how to glide through storms without being noticed. You didn't require an entourage. You didn't need to shout. Your shelter came from beyond the reach of their hands. And when people confront something shielded by a higher force, they lose, even if, for a moment, they believe they're winning. They unmask themselves in the act of trying to unmask you. And now their combined efforts only spotlight how unsettling you are to the fragile structures they depend on. You didn't just endure their onslaught. You unsettled them further by doing it with composure. That is strength. That is grace. That is a spirit beyond their grasp. What they mounted against you was not simply an attack. It was a silent confession. The moment their behavior shifted, when stories began swirling, when alliances began forming in corners, they spoke volumes without uttering a sentence. Because no one rallies this fiercely against what they truly believe to be insignificant. Their union wasn't about protection. It was about fear. Fear of what you carried quietly. Fear of what you revealed by existing. Fear of what your mere presence said about what they were hiding from themselves. In truth, what danger did you pose? You arrived with nothing but an unshakable core, nothing to trade or threaten. That's why their anxiety rose. Your steadiness made their facades tremble. Your rise made their stagnation feel heavier. Your peace made their chaos feel unbearable. And rather than facing what that said about them, they chose to cast you as the flaw. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. It's the oldest tactic. Vilify what unsettles you, so no one notices your own unraveling. They worked hard to brand you as unstable, arrogant, naive. Because if anyone dared to truly look, if anyone stood close enough to feel the quiet truth you carried, the myths they'd built would collapse. So they wove fear into a tale and called it the truth. But in spinning that, they betrayed their own fragility. Their whispers were not just rumors, they were flares, signaling that something about you disturbed the very ground they stood on. That's why it took a chorus, not a solo, to confront you. Their gathering revealed more about their insecurity than about your worth. In the end, the harder they pushed to bury you, the clearer it became that you held something rare, something untouchable, something their world wasn't ready to hold up to the light. Their unity was never a strategy. It was a confession dressed as resistance, and you never had to prove a thing. Their response was already proof enough. The reason their faces hardened and their words turned sharp was never because of an enemy in their midst. It was because they stumbled upon their own reflection. And the reflection didn't speak, didn't scold, didn't raise a hand. It simply existed, quietly unmasking the costumes they'd learned to wear. When lives have been assembled from illusions, pretenses, and borrowed pride, an authentic presence becomes a silent reckoning. Without uttering judgment, it forces buried truths to the surface. Instead of meeting their own shadows, they chose to recast you into a villain. No storms followed you. You simply made visible the disorder already swirling inside them. No accusations left your lips. You merely mirrored the cracks they'd painted over. That was the wound they couldn't bear. You made them remember every weakness they had dressed as confidence, every wound they had wrapped in arrogance, every remorse they'd numbed with smiles that never reached their eyes. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. So they did what felt safer. They hurled their discomfort outward. They wrapped it in stories. They branded it with names that absolved them of introspection. Because to admit what you revealed meant acknowledging all they had abandoned within themselves. Their rage was never about any action of yours. It was the silent memory of who they were before they bartered away their truth. You carried a steadiness they couldn't counterfeit, a resolve they couldn't imitate, a resilience they could neither explain nor dismantle. Rather than letting it inspire them, they grew hostile, because the quiet survival you embodied exposed just how loudly they'd been breaking under far less. Your ability to remain whole in places that would have fractured them left them unsettled, and they hated you for not hating in return. So they tried pulling you into their chaos, scoffing at your boundaries, questioning your intentions, twisting your silence into arrogance, because it was easier to accuse you of being too much than to face how little of themselves was left in comparison. Here's what they didn't realize. The elaborate theater of false support, the tight smiles, the disguised barbs, none of it fooled you. You had already learned to see beneath masks. You understood long before they did that this wasn't about you at all. It was about something inside you that quietly disrupted their carefully rehearsed roles. You weren't their undoing. You were a memory of what they once were before surrendering to fear. And when strangers begin to link arms and plot as though rehearsing for battle, it isn't ordinary rivalry anymore. It's a sign of something deeper at work. Ordinary jealousy doesn't require such orchestration. But when a presence enters the room and without trying starts unraveling facades, unseating quiet agreements, and unsettling what others thought untouchable, that's when their movements become deliberate. That's when their hostility takes shape like a strategy. And the weight of it is not rooted in the physical. It's rooted in what cannot be seen. There is something carried here that disturbs what has been entrenched for years. Rooms shift, not because of noise or force, but because authenticity makes comfortable darkness feel foreign. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of his sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor his kingdom. May his grace guide you always. Those hidden forces wearing polite faces, those long-standing patterns disguised as tradition, those unspoken contracts, they all sensed the disturbance before names were even exchanged. That's why resistance met you at the door. That's why it multiplied without clear cause. That's why even strangers seemed to bristle. What they failed to grasp was that the force shielding you ran deeper than the scheme surrounding you. You weren't seeking conflict, demanding space, or flaunting power. Yet the ground shook anyway. Why? Because opposition can recognize potential before you fully awaken to it yourself. Resistance knows that if you root yourself where you're meant to, everything in that place will have to reconfigure. So it sends distractions, confusion, and noise. Not to defeat you outright, but to loosen your hold before you realize how much you matter. What they didn't account for is that the covering over you was beyond their reach, impervious to whispers, plotting, and intimidation. Their unity was never proof of their strength. It was proof of their desperation. You weren't just unsettling their stories. You were rattling the very foundation those stories drew power from. And when the unseen world begins to tremble, it's because a chosen presence has arrived to disrupt what was never meant to last. And they all felt it, even if they pretended not to. The reason they could not erase what you carried is simple. When they failed to silence you, they sought to reshape you into something unrecognizable. That is what happens when a truth refuses to vanish. Once it became clear that every scheme collapsed, every snare only made you more steadfast, and every strike left you standing taller, they defaulted to their last weapon. They began rewriting your story, not with clarity or honesty, but with insinuations, distortions, and quiet suspicions designed to make others doubt you without ever daring to face you outright. They transformed your name into a legend passed around in whispers. Some claimed you had drifted into strangeness. Others insisted you were never steady to begin with. A few called you unpredictable, difficult to decipher, or simply too much. Yet if you paid attention, none of them could point to anything concrete. Only hazy grievances dressed up as fresh wounds and stories riddled with gaps. Still, the murmur continued, because as long as they controlled your image, they believed they could contain your reach. But they underestimated how even fabrications, repeated enough, begin to illuminate the very truth they aimed to bury. Your name kept surfacing where you weren't present. Your story lingered in conversations you never joined. What they had twisted into a warning slowly turned into a symbol, something they could neither understand nor ignore. There was never a need for you to protest their tales, because your constancy became louder than their confusion. While they shifted their narratives to suit the moment, you remained rooted. While they drifted in uncertainty, you walked with quiet certainty. Eventually, people began to notice. They realized no one exerts this much effort to extinguish someone who holds nothing of value. And when your actions began to outshine their fabrications, the fiction they crafted began to unravel into something entirely different, a message too sharp to suppress. Now it is your name they murmur about, not with contempt, but with a kind of hesitant reverence. The one they tried to erase, yet could not. You did not fade away. You became inevitable, a presence they could neither bury nor diminish, because what you carried was never theirs to define. And the most remarkable part? You never had to retaliate. Their attempt to erase you only ensured your story would outlast their noise, and their bitterness inadvertently carved you into memory. What you endured was not simply betrayal. It was an entire landscape engineered to crush you. Every corridor you walked through had already been adjusted. The weight in the air was deliberate. The silence was rehearsed. Conversations were laced with invisible snares. Long before you arrived, others had been briefed about what lens to view you through. This wasn't random bitterness. It was meticulous sabotage. They didn't just hope you'd feel unwelcome. They wanted you to question your own worth, your sanity, even your right to stand where you stood. Each room you entered had already been seeded with suspicion. They frayed your connections by feeding doubts into friendships. They tarnished your name quietly, then watched as you tried to piece together what had shifted. They even tried to convince you that you yourself were the flaw, as if the problem had always been you. They wanted not just to drive you out, but to see you collapse on your own. They believed that if they polluted enough around you, you would either shrink or shatter. But you didn't. You found new ways to remain upright. Even as the air thickened, you learned how to move through it without suffocating. You refused to harden. You felt the weight, but kept showing up. They witnessed you navigate spaces designed to crush your spirit, yet you retained your dignity. That's when the fear crept in. They began to understand something they hadn't accounted for. You weren't sculpted by them, so they could never unmake you. What you endured wasn't just social cruelty. It was psychological warfare. And you didn't just endure it. You transformed inside it. You emerged with sharper instincts, clearer vision, deeper calm. You learned to read rooms without words, to sense betrayal before it struck, to detect insincerity hidden behind applause. That kind of discernment was forged in the very pressure meant to annihilate you. Now you are immune to the tools they used to manipulate others. They thought they could erase you through a poisoned atmosphere, but instead you became the anomaly, the one who walked into a contaminated system and refused to absorb its toxins. And that is what unsettled them most, because if you could withstand what was crafted to dismantle you, then you could also rebuild what they've been quietly destroying. And deep down, they know it is only a matter of time. The quietest ones in the room turned out to be the sharpest blades. They smiled when it was convenient, but faded into the background when the air thickened. They weren't reckless or chaotic. They were steady witnesses. They watched the deception unfold, observed the games played in shadows, and heard the words that sliced through your name. And still, they chose to stand still. Not because they were unaware, but because preserving their own comfort outweighed the discomfort of truth. They convinced themselves their silence didn't count as harm, but it did. They never flung the first blow, but they stayed rooted in place while others struck. Some even nudged the harm along. Some let out nervous chuckles when your name was mocked. Some nodded to lies without speaking, thinking their restraint absolved them. But silence where there is wrong is never neutral. It is complicity dressed as restraint. Those who pride themselves on being above conflict were, in truth, only protecting themselves. They watched you stumble under the weight of cold shoulders and poisoned words and decided it wasn't their concern as long as their own place remained secure. And what cut deeper than their apathy was the quiet satisfaction in their eyes. The way your fall validated their unwillingness to rise. They'll act surprised now that the truth is cracking through the surface. They'll feign ignorance about how dark it really was. But memory is clear. You remember who averted their eyes, who vanished when it counted, who swallowed words when they could have spoken. No need for revenge. Life keeps its own account. What they thought was buried has started to unearth itself, and this time it stains every hand that stayed clean by turning away. Outwardly, they may look untarnished, but beneath the surface, they carry what they refuse to face. And reckoning has a long memory. It doesn't just come for the ones who acted. It visits the ones who watched and waited for you to break, only to discover you didn't. They treated you less like a human being and more like an object of curiosity. They prodded at your boundaries, pushed at your calm, disrupted your balance just to see if you would crack. They didn't speak in roars, but moved in careful, quiet patterns, as though documenting each reaction for their own satisfaction. Every hurt you endured became fodder for their private amusement. Every pause, every stumble, every silent tear became material to dissect. You became the invisible headline in rooms where you were never invited. But what they missed was that someone else was observing, too, and not with the intent to diminish, but to elevate. Where they chronicled your pain to prove a point. Something greater kept record to build you into something untouchable. Every snare they set became a step. Every betrayal became a lesson. Every silent victory was stored for something more. What they believed would be your undoing was quietly shaping your ascent. They mistook you for a specimen to be measured, but you were being refined for something beyond their reach. And in time, what they thought was evidence against you became undeniable evidence of your resilience. You stopped being their spectacle and became the benchmark, the one others point to as proof you can endure without bitterness, be stripped down, and still rise with dignity. They thought the data they collected would destroy you, but every observation only confirmed the depth of what you carried. You became more than a story. You became a symbol of what cannot be broken. Now they watch in uneasy awe, realizing the experiment they mocked has become a model they cannot ignore. What they believed was a breakdown was the blueprint unfolding, and what they studied to ridicule now serves as a testament they wish they understood. The very words meant to dismantle you became the scaffolding that lifted you higher. Every false tale, every distorted version of your story, every calculated whisper stacked upon itself until it formed a platform you never asked for but were destined to stand on. They believed their inventions would bury you, but all they managed to do was provide more ground for you to rise from. They thought dragging your name through confusion would erase your essence. Yet all it did was amplify your presence. In their minds, they were blotting you out, but in reality, they were sketching you into spaces you hadn't even stepped foot in yet. The fabrications they flung into the air never disappeared. They settled into something solid, something that could no longer be ignored. They kept expecting the lies to undo you, yet you stood still while the very dust they stirred became the bricks beneath your feet. They handed you betrayal, but it was reshaped into direction. They handed you slander, but it was reworked into stature. Each insult only sharpened your edges. Each rumor only clarified who you really were. While they chased shadows and gossiped loudly, you remained quiet. You moved deliberately, letting them exhaust themselves with their own noise. What confused them most was that their efforts to silence you kept echoing your name louder and farther than they intended. Because what they never understood is that every blow was already accounted for. Every attempt folded seamlessly into a story already written. None of it was wasted. Not a single word spoken against you failed to find its place in the foundation of what you were becoming. What they meant to be your undoing instead became the reason you were impossible to dismiss. Their resistance only shaped your ascent. The fire they lit to consume, you became the light revealing your strength. And the irony they will never name is this: they were never architects of your downfall. They were laborers unknowingly building your victory. Every insult a rung, every betrayal a plank, every falsehood a cornerstone. And from here, where they never wanted you to stand, the view reminds you of one thing: they could never decide how high you would climb. They ransacked through your life as though tearing apart a locked room, desperate to find flaws where there were none. They scavenged through memories, connections, half-forgotten moments, hoping to stitch together a story dark enough to dim your light. It wasn't anger that drove them. It was their own reflection staring back at them, reminding them of everything they refused to become. Yet the deeper they searched, the cleaner the path beneath you remained. Their hunger for scandal only revealed how little there was to hold on to. The more they clawed, the more their own fractures surfaced, fractures they thought no one could see. Panic began to flicker in their eyes as they unearthed their own hidden wreckage instead of yours. What was meant to humiliate, you became a mirror they couldn't look away from. Their relentless digging turned into a confession they didn't mean to make. They needed you to stumble, to justify their bitterness. They needed to point at something in you to excuse everything lacking in them. But when the soil around you yielded no weapons, the spotlight they shone on you swung back onto them. The cracks they disguised with charm began showing. The envy they cloaked in false concern became obvious. The manipulation they thought no one noticed started to unravel. And what they called seeking justice revealed itself for what it really was: a refusal to confront themselves. One by one, the people who had eagerly believed their narrative began to question. The same mouths that accused you began scrambling to explain themselves. The same hands that pointed now worked to shield their own shame. In the end, the story they were writing wasn't yours, it was theirs. Their obsession with finding your flaws only broadcasted their own. And what they tried to uncover in you became the very proof of what they'd buried inside themselves all along. What they thought would break, you only revealed the version of you they weren't ready to meet. They assumed the pressure would leave you in pieces, that the manipulation, the exclusion, the stage chaos would send you spiraling or make you disappear entirely. But what happened instead startled even you. Right in the thick of their schemes, something inside you shifted. You didn't just hold steady. You began to evolve before their eyes. They were watching for cracks while you were quietly taking notes, cataloging every move, deciphering every pattern. Each sting became a lesson, Every silent wound refined your intuition. Every calculated slight taught you how to see through masks. They assumed your quiet moments were signs of retreat. They didn't understand you were reconstructing yourself, methodically, deliberately, almost imperceptibly. Their storms didn't dissolve your essence. They clarified it.